Understand how your customer gets value from using your product, not from buying it, not in terms of what the product offering is in terms of features, but how they actually use it.
Coffee's for closers only.
So we've established my proposal is sound in principle. Now we're just haggling over price.
Let's see how much we're going for on eBay.
It's the same as Dunkin' Donuts. Costs 15 times the price.
Welcome to Impact Pricing, the podcast where we discuss pricing, value, and the future relationship between them. I'm Mark Stiving. Today our guest is Ed Arnold. Here are 3 things you want to know about Ed before we start. He's an advisor at Ibbaka. He was the VP of products at LeveragePoint for 10 years. And hopefully you know who that company is. And probably my favorite thing about Ed, he got to work with Tom Nagle. Welcome, Ed.
Thanks, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, for anybody who doesn't know, who's Tom Nagle?
Tom Nagle, he is the legend in the pricing strategy world, wrote probably the most famous book on pricing, The Strategy and Tactics of Pricing, I think in its 6th edition. Anyone who knows anything about pricing or pretends to should have a copy of that book.
Yeah, I actually taught from that book when I was a professor, 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. So that was pretty, he was always been high on my list.
Yep. And you see his influence everywhere, whether or not people give him attribution.
Yeah. So how did you get into pricing?
It happened when I was at the Monitor Group, when I was working with Tom Nagle, because at the time, Tom and his team were part of the strategic pricing practice there. At that time, I was a product manager. I was creating e-learning products based on the Monitor Group IP. Monitor had this idea of getting into the software business, and we can do a whole separate show on why consultants should not go into the software business. But anyway, they wanted to do that, and we were cranking away. And then they said, "Hey, Ed, we want to do an e-learning course on this strategic pricing stuff with Tom Nagle." And so we started working on it, and I very quickly came to the decision that I did not want to make this into an e-learning course. I wanted to create a tool where people could actually make pricing decisions. And that's how I got started.
Is that where LeveragePoint came from?
Yes. What happened was a variety of things happened, but basically the headwinds from the financial crisis in the late 2000s forced Monitor to try to shed some costs. So all these software groups, we were one of probably a half dozen software entities within the Monitor Group. So we actually had the opportunity to spin out as an independent company.
Nice. And so I'll try to explain LeveragePoint, and then you correct me when I'm wrong. Mm-hmm. I realize you don't work there anymore, but LeveragePoint is a company that allows, or actually is a software application mm-hmm. that allows companies to try to document the value that they're offering and be able to communicate that value to potential buyers. How is that?
Very good. Very good. I'll also say that we were the first SaaS value-based pricing software company back when, SaaS wasn't as big a deal as it is. So we were the first, and actually it created a whole category. Now there's at least 2 or 3 other companies that are also in that same business.
Nice. Well, speaking of SaaS, that's what we're going to talk about today. I always ask people, what are they passionate about and what do we want to talk about? And you had said the future of value-based pricing in the subscription economy, one of my favorite topics.
Right.
So first off, wide open softball. What do you think about the future of value-based pricing in the subscription economy?
I think it's the new frontier, and a new frontier not only from the point of view of a customer base to adopt value-based pricing, but also changing the nature and the direction of how value-based pricing will evolve in the future because of it being a SaaS subscription world.
So there's lots of questions that I always have when we think about subscriptions and value-based pricing. It seems like a lot of companies are going I'm going to use the word fixed fee in value-based pricing, meaning they're not negotiating individual prices. It's, hey, that you get to see it on the web page and you can buy one of these 3 packages or this many users. So does that detract from the concept of capturing more value from our customers, or does that add to it?
Well, what's really interesting about those pricing pages, Mark, and we've all seen them, right? The 3 or the 5 tiers. And the example that I always like to use is Salesforce, right? So Salesforce was sort of, in many ways, an inspiration for LeveragePoint. I wanted to grow up to be like a Salesforce company. That last tier doesn't have any prices on it. Never does.
And it's almost always labeled enterprise
or negotiated, or there's always some kind of word in there that means call us and we'll talk. And that's really, if you're thinking about, what sort of animal you're hunting in the enterprise game, right? Those are the whales, right? So the whales get that pricing. And it's really interesting in the subscription world, especially with product-led growth, which is all about, selling the product without a salesperson, right? The product is actually selling itself. That works really well in those earlier tiers, right? Because the value, is immediate with the user, right? And if you think of all this successful case studies like Slack, for example, Slack was around free for years, right? Until it built up, and now it's becoming it's become sort of de facto software. What's interesting is that when it gets to that certain threshold, I don't know what the number is, in terms of the number of users or the size of the organization, then it kind of flips into classic enterprise value, just like any other large manufacturing company. And a lot of companies are grappling with that right now in the subscription space, especially those that are trying to compete with the giants, the leaders in the space. And I think value is the only way you can differentiate yourself in the enterprise market.
So I think that makes sense. I'm just going to think out loud for a second, Ed, and then think with me if you don't mind.
Mm-hmm.
We can take these enterprise companies and let's say they're worth, multiple millions of dollars to us in revenue.
Mm-hmm.
And so it makes all the sense in the world to negotiate, to sell value, do all the things we would with a traditional product.
Right.
And then as we start to come down market, there hits a point where we say, look, it's okay that I'm not capturing every dollar from my customer because I'm automating the process. I'm making it easier for them to acquire and grow.
Mm-hmm.
And so where do you think that line is? How do we make the decision on when we switch from buy at this price to, hey, we're going to negotiate with you?
I'm not sure, honestly, Mark, but I know that land and expand is in everyone's vocabulary in that market, right? So this idea is that you do want to have all your customers grow to whatever level, they're comfortable with, according to whatever your ICP is, your ideal customer profile, right? But, if you are really going after enterprise or large enterprise, which I think many companies are, you want to get to that, you want them to grow to that higher tier, that highest tier. Now, there may be some markets where there's a limit to how far that subscription can grow, right? But that's a strategic decision about where does your growth come from, right? Like where in the addressable market. And, it's kind of interesting in our work at Ibbaka, a lot of times we do an analysis of what their average accounts are. First, we ask them, and then we look at their CRM. And it's amazing what you see when you actually look at the real data. You say, well, what's a typical account? And they'll throw out, the ones that they like to talk about, right? The big success stories. When you actually look at the averages, you see a lot of, smallish accounts that are kind of stuck and not growing, right? So understanding what sort of critter you're really hunting. Are you really going after, are you going after deer? Are you going after whale? Or are you just shooting a lot of squirrels? Sorry to use that gross analogy, but
Hunting analogy, yes.
yes. Well, it's popular in some sales literature, but it's like what are you going after, and what do you actually have in your collection right now? That's really interesting, because if your service model is somewhat high touch, and you've got a lot of accounts that are below the cost of before too expensive to serve, then you got a problem, right? So that's why investors love product-led growth companies, because they grow very, very fast and they scale very quickly and cheaply. But again,
the idea is that there's very low, if any, cost to serve an individual customer. So
not directly, yeah, but it's all in the software. I mean, that software is being improved every day, right? And they're spending lots and lots of money on it. And so I did a talk with Virtual Product Camp last summer, where I was comparing product-led growth to the expansion of fast food industry in the 1960s. And I said, basically the leading PLG companies were really following McDonald's model, which is standardize the offering, economies of scale, invest in the backroom operations to make it as efficiency, own your supply chain, and push. And that's exactly what product-led growth companies are doing, and why they had such great growth. Now, when you get a market that gets saturated with competitors, right, which is what's happening now in the B2B SaaS world, these competitive market spaces are getting very concentrated. If you look at a market map for marketing automation, I don't know, there'd be like 10,000 individual dots on that map right now. What is going on there, right? You sort of run out of market. That's why I think pricing and value is going to be really key, and very clever segmentation in terms of user profiles.
So one of the things, as you were talking, that struck me is, in this world of product-led growth, it makes so much sense to create a new product, and then we go after startup companies or smaller companies, SMBs, because the big enterprise companies aren't going to buy from us. They don't trust that we're going to be around in a year, and there's a million reasons why.
Yeah.
And so to build this almost no cost to serve a customer, be able to get into a startup or SMB type marketplace and grow quickly, not negotiate, not have salespeople, this is just a brilliant business model. And then one day you get to grow up and play with enterprise. Now, the opposite, though, I don't think is very easy, because I actually work with several clients who started in enterprise, and they have such a high cost to serve, such a high implementation cost. They can't see how to let go of that and get down into the product-led growth, the no cost to serve a customer.
Yeah, no, it's tough. And we've worked with clients that, say they want to be product-led growth, and we look at what they're doing, we're saying, nah. Don't even try. I mean, you have to completely change your business model to make it work. But what's really interesting, Mark, is that, and this actually came out in the pricing conference that you and I recently attended, is that the blur between B2B and B2C, I mean, they're kind of merging, right? So when you think, for example, like with Slack, no corporate buyer ever heard of Slack until, thousands of people in their company were already using it. Right. So in a sense that, the business employee is a consumer, and that's how product-led growth companies are getting that initial growth. They're making it so ridiculously easy for people to start using it before the corporate procurement folks have, or even IT department have any idea that they're using it. That's what makes that model so attractive for investors. It's like you're sort of tying up the users before the corporations even are aware of it. To me, that's a sign of a brilliant product strategy.
Yeah. So what I often find interesting is that we look at these strategies, product-led growth or subscription. We say, wow, that's the future. And then I take a step back and I say, well, that actually works well with this type of product, but it doesn't work well with that type of product. Right? So I would challenge you to put together a subscription model for caskets, right? or if you think about product-led growth, the reason Slack or Calendly, these companies are so successful is because individuals get value from the product by themselves. I don't need the company to adopt it. I don't need a ton of people to have it. I get value. And then when enough people inside a big company have adopted this, now all of a sudden it makes sense to build an enterprise. Let's socialize it. Let's get it communicating the company.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what I like about product-led growth is this idea of instant gratification, right? The user has to get value, even if it's free.
Yep.
The user has to get value with it in the first 15 minutes. Now, that's a really high hurdle for any software product designer, me included. And we've fallen short of that, right? Where it's like, oh no, you have to have the training, you have to have this, and you have to have that, and you may sell the person who bought the software, but then you go back and look at the subscription and say, well, wait, only 5% of the users ever logged in. I mean, it's really understanding what that use case, what that job to be done is, and allowing someone to very quickly, download it, try it, use it, and get value out of it quickly. Like you can go through the whole buying process and the first usage hurdle in 15 minutes, right? And I mean, I think all of us have had examples of that, especially, when you're trying to get something done and you don't want to go through corporate to buy, a software package. And hey, I just want something that can do a roadmap, right? So what can I use as a freemium? Or I've got all these business contacts that I need to organize and do an email campaign, all of those like tasks that people just want to get done quickly, right? That's the product-led growth companies figured that out. And especially if one that is based around team collaboration, virtual team collaboration, which is one of the reasons why Zoom and Slack and et cetera have really taken off. That makes it even more valuable. That gives it more of a velocity.
Yeah, I think Zoom and Slack and Calendly are three great examples of things that you can pick up and use and get value from really quickly.
Yeah, and I use all three, and have, and it amazes me when people don't use those things, right?
I don't use Slack.
Oh yeah, well we use Slack a lot, and it's funny. I mean, where I'm working at Ibbaka, and I have clients now that I believe that you got to meet clients where they are, right? So if they want to talk by the phone, you talk on the phone. If it's Slack, a lot of clients, younger, more, tech savvy, they want to communicate in Slack, right? So things that would take the whole structure of communication has changed. And sometimes I'll bring it up in some of the meetings I have, and they say, well, how do you know that? Well, I was just slacking with this person over the last, 3 days, and we were having this running conversation about something, right? And that developed a relationship that would not have happened in the old days. In my old days as a consultant, you flew out and you spent, weeks, living at the client office, right? Those days are over. Now it's all through Slack, and I'm more happy with that, honestly.
I'm sure someday a client will ask me to do that, but until that happens, I'm happy not using just another software application.
Try it. It will cut your emails down. So it's not additive. It will make you more efficient.
No worries. Ed, this is always fun. What else do you think is hard about pricing and subscriptions? What do we get wrong?
I think a lot of it is, I think the number one thing is, what is your pricing metric? So what we like to do is we like to talk about three types of metrics. There's the pricing metric, how you charge for something. There's the usage metric, how do you keep track of how much I'm using? And then the most important one is the value metric, right? How much value do I get from it? And one of the truths about value is that you get value by using stuff. If you buy something you don't use, you get zero value. So it's really understanding, how people get value out of software. And so you got to link those three together, right? Ideally, if you could link those three together, you're in nirvana, because your price is aligned with value and it's aligned with usage and everything is great. Really hard to do. So what's really the predominant pricing metric right now in software and subscriptions is user, per user, right? A very unimaginative metric and one that often doesn't align with value, right? So at the end, and I've had these conversations at LeveragePoint. We signed up 1,000 people, got a great deal, but only 3 people, logged in, or 10 people logged in, right? I said, yeah, but those people who did just, created $100 million worth of value for your company. So go figure. So that to me is one of the big issues in subscription pricing, is really aligning with the right metric. Recently, after a lot of effort, I got one of our clients to switch their metric from user to something else. I can't reveal what that is, but it made all the difference in terms of how they positioned themselves on value. So now they can measure this based on actual usage and value, and so those three things are aligned.
Nice. So I want to say that I love the fact that you use pricing metric and value metric the way you do.
Mm-hmm.
I also love the fact that you added usage metric, because I've never used the word usage metric, and I love that. I think that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah. Well, usage-based pricing is making a big comeback, man.
So I'm a little frustrated by usage-based pricing.
Yeah.
In the sense that all it is choosing a usage as your pricing metric.
Yeah, it's really hard to do because it's like the old phone bill, right? Remember the old phone bills when they had like 50 pages?
Yep.
And for a product manager, that was like, we hated that, right? Because it discouraged people from, using it, like turn down the heat, don't use that as much. You don't want to do that, right? You want to make it all you can eat, use as much as you want. But in some areas, I know Amazon does usage quite effectively. AWS uses that quite effectively. So in some markets, in some products, depending on how it's being used, then it makes sense. But for most businesses, it does not.
Yeah. So it's not that I hate usage-based pricing. Mm-hmm. It's that I'm frustrated by the fact that it's suddenly become this really big deal, mm-hmm. where all it is a subset of a pricing metric.
Yeah, but you've lived long enough where all that is new is old.
Yeah.
So for a lot of folks who never saw it before, but if you started your career in the last 10 years, you probably never heard of it before.
Yeah. So are you going to pay Netflix by the movie that you watch?
Well, there you go. Right. I know what I would do. I mean, interesting cable, don't get me started on Comcast. Right. But, you got 200 channels and there's nothing to watch. Right. I would pay dearly to have just 20 channels that I would love to watch, but I want to be able to pick each one individually. And I want to be able to start and stop them whenever I want to, right? But they'll, that true usage-based pricing model that I would like to see in cable will never happen. Never happen.
I want to take you back to something you said a second ago, because it's something I've never heard anyone else talk about yet. Mm-hmm. And that is, when you got someone to change their pricing metric from usage to something else,
mm-hmm. from per user.
How hard was it to make the change?
Oh, it was really hard. I mean, it took weeks, if not months, to move the needle on that one.
Yeah, even if the CEO says, let's do it,
mhm.
there's tons of things inside the company that now have to shift.
Yes. Yeah, no, I mean, it was hard, but I'm very proud of it because it was the right thing to do. But it took a lot of convincing and up and down the line in the organization. And yeah, so it's a big change management one. But like I said, when it's the right thing to do and it makes sense, it does pay dividends. But it's tough, and I think it's really a leap of faith in doing it.
Yeah. Have you seen? And I can imagine, but I can't picture an example in my head of a company using more than one pricing metric. It's almost like if I buy a car, I can take a loan or I can lease it.
Yes. There is a software company that I recently ran into. QuickBase is the company. It's one of these no-code platforms, and I think they give you the option of doing things by the application or by the user. So there are some software vendors that are starting to experiment with that in certain markets.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought. But
Yeah.
you have to ask yourself, how does that relate to value, and are we really capturing the value from our customers then?
Well, you would really need to do the analysis on the value, which means really understanding what Nagle would call the value drivers, right, and how those value drivers line up with those different metrics. So you have to do the homework on that, and it's different for every customer. I mean, when we used to build value models in the early days of LeveragePoint, we used to use the pricing metric as the value metric, which was ridiculous in some cases. So, for example, if I was working with a commodity supplier, not commodity supplier, but like a material supplier, and they sold things by the kilogram, right? It was kind of funny to say it's $3 or $3 per kilogram of value, and we're pricing its price is $10 per kilogram, and the value is $3. It didn't make sense, right? So what does an organization understand in terms of value? Well, per year makes sense, right? You know what I mean? So if we, so even though our material is more expensive per kilogram, the end result is you're going to get this much more profit per year. And, so that was the first inkling that you needed to have multiple metrics, and you switch between the two. But if you could link them together and it makes sense, right? Like the old example that everyone hears about, aircraft engines.
Yep.
Everyone in the pricing world has heard that one, power by the hour. That's a perfect example of value, usage, and price perfectly being aligned, right? But trying to do that for other businesses, trust me, it's really hard to get those three to line up perfectly.
Yep, understood. Ed, we are almost out of time, but I got to ask you the final question.
Mm-hmm.
What's one piece of pricing advice you'd give our listeners that you think could have a big impact on their business?
Understand how your customer gets value from using your product, not from buying it, not in terms of what the product offering is in terms of features, but how they actually use it. And it's usually multiple stakeholders. So understand value from those multiple perspectives. A lot of times, customers underestimate the value they get out of your solution. They're just, because they don't bother to measure it, right? It works, but just go through that thought exercise of what it would cost if they took that out and replaced it with nothing, or your competitor. You should know that. Nice. That's the number one thing.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you another question. First off, I love your answer. I thought that was great. And the answer that you gave kind of implied an opinion. And I'm going to ask you because I want to know. You said not how your buyers buy.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think of behavioral economics?
I'm fascinated by it. It's kind of a new subject for me. But what it means to me is that in your customer's head, there's a left and a right brain thing going on. So there's the rational, and then there's the perception. And a lot of value is perception. It's whatever the customer believes it is, and they'll come up with the logic to justify it after the fact. So that's what behavioral economics does, is it shows, but it actually breaks that down into how you could use that to understand what value is. So I think you need to take that into an account as well. I think that more comes into play, when the customer is actually making the purchase decision. Even if you convince them that there's a lot of value in something, if they feel personally they're at risk for taking it on, that will hold them back. And that's part of what the behavioral economics tells you, that I'll stick with something that I know stinks, but at least I won't get fired for it. Right.
Yeah. Nice. I think we're kindred spirits. We think a lot alike in almost everything we discussed today, which was pretty good. Mm-hmm. And my opinion is value and behavioral economics are essentially two very different things, and we have to think about them differently. Mm-hmm. You really can't do just one. You never do a price increase and communicate it poorly to your customers. You would communicate it as well as you could, which is behavioral economics.
It is, and you'll see it a lot more on the B2C side of the fence. I mean, I think it's a lot about perceptions and behavior. On the B2B side, I mean, it's much more skewed towards the rational and the economic, but it's still there, right? Yeah. And so it never goes away. So you need to take it into account.
Nice. Ed, thank you so much for your time today. If anybody wants to contact you, how can they do that?
Best way is through my email. So it's ed.arnold, ARNOLD, at Ibbaka.com. And Ibbaka is IBBAKA.com.
Well, I'm glad you spelled that, because I would have spelled it incorrectly.
I may have. We might have to fix that in post, but I'm pretty sure that's correct.
Okay, good. Episode 173 is all done. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this, would you please leave us a rating and a review? Speaking of reviews, Insani via Apple Podcasts wrote, "Practical and relevant. This is an absolutely amazing podcast. It provides real people talking about real world problems. I've implemented many of the discussions in this podcast into my organization, and the value is felt immediately." Thank you, Insani. I hugely appreciate it. And if you have any colleagues who are interested in pricing, please share this podcast with them. If you have any questions or comments about the podcast or pricing in general, feel free to email me, mark@impactpricing.com. Now, go make an impact.